Well, I would like to welcome everybody today on our Thursday Alliance, the second Thursday of every month. And today we're very, very fortunate to have John Howe with us again. I don't think I need to introduce John. We seem to have heard him before. He is our we're so lucky to have him as our church historian. And he just has brought us a couple of wonderful programs. And I look forward to this one as well. And before John begins, I want you to know that in a month, on April the 9th, Thursday, April the 9th, we're going to be having Will Brownsberger as our presenter. And and the topic that we're going to have him talk about is about what has led him to make a career of public service. What are his passions and what is his life story? And I think that will be really wonderful to hear Will Brownsberger. He is a church member and knows us all quite well. So I'm going to turn our program today over to John Howe, who's going to be talking about the Boston Public Garden and the statuary that are in the garden, what is in the garden, what is out of the garden, and the stories related to that. So take it away, John.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kathy. And Mark, why don't we do this do-si-do so that I can get my screen shared? This is just going to take a second here. Good. So good morning, and I want to thank everybody, especially Kathy, for offering me the opportunity to talk about this issue. It's really the focus is representation in public art. It's one that's come to fascinate me in recent years, and I hope it will interest you as well. Just for a little background, I was born in Boston, and the city has always interested me. But apart from about a dozen years working in the heart of downtown, until the last decade or so, I really wasn't very familiar with other parts of the city. Boston, as a lot of folks know, was cobbled together through a combination of organic growth and also the annexation of several surrounding towns in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And there's a great deal to discover beyond the downtown. Now, starting with my retirement at the onset of the pandemic, I've been spending a good deal of time getting to know my native city better. And I've found that one can learn a lot from visiting the city's branch libraries, its parks, its cemeteries, Revolutionary War sites, its varied streetscapes, commercial districts, and historic churches. And a couple of years ago, I gave a talk about Unitarian meeting houses that now house formerly Unitarian churches that now house worship communities from other traditions. So I know all of us find long nature walks very restorative, but I get a great deal of pleasure out of a day of urban orienteering where I find new pathways across unfamiliar parts of the city on foot or by transit. And it was a couple of years ago, I think I was going out to visit Kathy Carpenter in Jamaica Plain when I was riding a bus along Columbia Road and I spotted through the trees this big statue on a massive granite pedestal. And it was in a sort of a modest neighborhood surrounded by typical Boston triple deckers. And the historian in me asked, who is that man? And how the heck did such a massive statue end up here? And then looking more closely, I saw from the inscription that this was Edward Everett, a native of Dorchester who was actually born nearby this spot. Richardson Park, as the spot is known, is just a stone's throw from his birthplace and from Edward Everett Square, a busy junction close by. And this certainly was not the originally intended home for such a big statue. And Everett's journey to Richardson Park has turned out to be quite long and tortuous. And as I delved back into the story of Everett, I was led down a rabbit hole into a broader topic, the growth of portrait statuary in Boston and how the choices of which figures should be depicted in the city's public spaces 100 years ago reflect and in some ways anticipate some of the same issues of representation in public art that have been vexing many American cities within the past decade, especially in this time of racial reckoning since the death of George Floyd. Now, while I was digging into the story of Everett's statue, I found there are also a handful of other statues with stories that take strange and unexpected twists. And to keep the scope of the talk manageable, I'm going to be focusing on one specific locale, which I consider Boston's most sacred civic precinct, the Boston Public Garden. And I'm also going to be focusing on statuary that originates in one specific time period, roughly a half century from about the mid 1870s to the mid 1920s. Today, you can find a total of 8 portrait statues in various parts of the public garden, and we'll meet all 8. But my talk is really going to focus in more detail on 5 specific figures that I'll call the Wanderers. And that's what gave me the idea for this title, Out of the Garden. What they have in common is the fact that they were either placed in the garden and later removed, like this one, or proposed for the garden and declined or rejected. 4 of them have found homes elsewhere around the city, and one appears to have been lost forever. Now, I'm going to start with a very brief background on sculpture and statuary in America. Sculpture was actually a primitive or almost non-existent art form in our country's early days, right up until the early 19th century. I imagine this might have been due to Puritan attitudes about art and graven images. Here are some photos of typical ship figureheads of the late 18th and early 19th century. Ship prows would have been one of the very few places where one might find sculpture of any type in colonial and early Republican America. In colonial Boston, if one wanted to procure a statue or a portrait bust, one sent to London for it. For example, there are several portrait busts in King's Chapel in Boston from the colonial era, all of which are English in origin. Now, a small number of Americans began to go abroad to study sculpture in the 1820s. William Rush of Philadelphia, whose dates are 1756 to 1833, is considered the first prominent sculptor in America, and he actually got his start sculpting ship figureheads. But if there was one event that electrified American interest in sculpture, it was the unveiling in 1843 of this statue, The Greek Slave, by Hiram Powers. He was a Vermont-born artist who trained in France and brought the classical sculptural tradition to America. And this statue caused a true sensation as it toured the country. It was crafted in the era of the Greek struggle for independence, and it depicts a young Greek woman captured and sold into slavery in Constantinople. It was among the very first American sculptural works that fully reflected the great European classical tradition, and it helped to inspire a new generation of Americans to travel to Europe for the best possible training in sculptural technique. Many of these great artists had strong ties to Boston and New England. And let's meet a handful, for example. They include Augustus St. Gaudens, who was born in France to French and Irish parents, had a studio in New York, a home in Vermont, and who did the famous Shaw Memorial opposite the State House entrance, considered by many the greatest sculpture in America, and one of the sculptures I'd love to talk about in a follow-up lecture. Another is Thomas Ball, who was born in Charlestown, originally a separate town, but part of Boston from the 1870s. Cyrus Dallin worked largely in Arlington, and he did that magnificent statue in front of the MFA. And Daniel Chester French, who did the Lincoln statue at the Lincoln Memorial, was born, I believe, in Exeter, New Hampshire, and worked in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And then with changing tastes and the rise of modernism and the onset of the Great Depression, this tradition of sculpture and statuary in the tradition of Romantic realism went into decline. And in the mid 20th century, designs became somewhat simpler and more abstract, and there were overall fewer commissions for works of this type. So this earlier era, 1870s to 1920s, remains, at least in my personal view, the high watermark for American portrait statuary, and certainly specifically in Boston. And Boston, relative to the city's size, was at the forefront of this movement. And this is when the garden's portfolio of statues was established and has really remained sort of fixed in amber for 100 years. Now, one thing is clear from the outset: the great majority of figures of this era were of white Protestant men. In Boston, just as was the case across the whole country. A few years ago, in 2021, after the George Floyd uprising, a landmark study of American statuary was conducted. It's called the National Monument Audit, and it was published by an organization called Monument Lab. You can look it up with this web link. And this survey found that as of 2020, some 88% of all the existing public monuments in America were to white men. The 10 most frequently depicted subjects, here's a table from that study. The 10 most frequently depicted subjects were Lincoln and Washington, Christopher Columbus, Martin Luther King, St. Francis of Assisi, Robert E. Lee, Casimir Pulaski, Benjamin Franklin, JFK, and Thomas Jefferson. I won't go through the others, but you can look them up in this study. Now, here's a second take of the same slide in which I've circled in green figures that are depicted in outdoor statuary in Boston. And they include the top four, plus Franklin, Thaddeus Kosciuszko, Harriet Tubman, John F. Kennedy, and Alexander Hamilton. Now, I've made two red circles around Lincoln and Columbus to indicate that these Boston statues have been removed in recent years. And I've indicated with the white circle around Dr. Martin Luther King that he is represented in Boston, but in a somewhat more abstract form in the Embrace statue on the Boston Common. Now, here's a list I found in Wikipedia, the Boston Art Commission's list of all the portrait statues within Boston city limits. And it turns out that of some 45 statues of figures depicted here in Boston, only 7 are on the Monument Lab list. So what that implies is that there's only a small degree of overlap between these two lists. A lot of our Boston statues are of historic figures whose depictions are unique to our city, and many of these statues are of very high artistic quality. So here's a map of the central city. I've circled in red where the garden is located, and I don't want to downplay, there are many other fine groups of statuary elsewhere in the city. For example, the Commonwealth Avenue Mall, the Charles River Esplanade, the State House grounds, or the Freedom Trail. And these are all topics for another day. And as I mentioned, I am taking this talk from a longer talk I gave, which also focused on African American figures throughout the city and how Boston has addressed the issue of representation of African American men and women in recent years. So I do hope that next year we can delve into part 2 of this talk. Now let's turn to the origins of the garden itself. It was chartered in 1839 and constructed on filled land as Peninsular Boston, that original city in the background, began its westward push into the reclaimed Back Bay. This is an 1850s lithograph, and it depicts the garden in its earliest stage of development. Now, the garden featured no statuary at all until the late 1860s. And over the next couple of decades, there were just a few statues, 3 or 4 we'll be discussing. And frankly, no formal process for this citing works of art around the city. And then between about 1890 and the mid-20s, we entered a period of flux with statues, pathways, and plantings all being added, moved, removed and a general ongoing shift of the design of the garden. But by 1927, with only very minor exceptions, the garden was populated with the entire suite of statuary you find there today. Although I don't want to minimize the importance, for example, of the Make Way for Ducklings figures, which are among the most popular sculptures that are sought out by children and parents from around the world. You see them going through the garden and stopping at those, at the depiction of the ducklings. My own earliest memory as a child goes back to swan boat rides in the early 60s. And when I go through the garden today with its statues, its swan boats, the picturesque footbridge, and the tall, mature willow trees overhanging the lagoon, it feels almost timeless. And it would be quite recognizable to a time traveler from a century ago, and certainly from 1941, which was the date of Robert McCloskey's book. Now let's start looking at individual works. The very first sculptural monument of any kind in the garden was the Ether Monument, installed in about 1867 or 8. This work did not commemorate a historical figure, but rather an event, the discovery of the use of ether for anesthesia that was made nearby at Massachusetts General Hospital in 1846. Now, this is a Victorian Gothic style monument in granite, and it's quite unlike all of the bronze statues in the more classical tradition that would follow. But about the same time, the very first historical figure to be depicted in statuary in the garden was installed. And this was Edward Everett, whom we've already met. And let me introduce him. He was a prominent Massachusetts statesman, the first of 4 Boston Unitarian ministers we'll be meeting. He was ordained at age 19, and he served the Brattle Street Church in the heart of Boston. But he left the field of church ministry early in his career and went on to hold numerous public offices. He became, in turn, a professor of ancient Greek at Harvard, a US congressman, the governor of Massachusetts, the ambassador to Great Britain, the president of Harvard College, the United States Secretary of State, this United States Senator from Massachusetts, and finally, in the election of 1860, he was a candidate for vice president on one of the tickets that lost to Lincoln. And along the way, Everett was the largely unsung founder of the Boston Public Library and the savior of Washington's Mount Vernon estate. He toured the country tirelessly, giving speeches to raise funds to rescue Mount Vernon from decay and ruin in the 1850s and 60s. So truly, this man has one of the most impressive resumes in all of American history. Perhaps above all, Everett was known as one of the nation's greatest orators in an era where the gift of oratory was highly prized. He was among the strongest proponents of maintaining the Union in the lead up to the Civil War. But he was quite pointedly not an abolitionist. Rather, he is remembered as a conservative, anti-slavery, pro-unionist, whose historic reputation has probably suffered because he was willing to compromise with Southern slave interests in order to maintain the Union. This ultimately turned out to be a losing political position. Anyway, in November of 1863, Everett was so highly regarded nationally that he was chosen as the featured speaker at the dedication of the Gettysburg Battlefield Cemetery. He gave a stirring 2-hour oration that was very well received. And I have to think Americans in those days had longer attention spans and stronger bladders. He was followed immediately thereafter by President Lincoln, who was supposed to make a cameo appearance. But it turns out that Lincoln's brief address upstaged Everett's grandiloquent oration, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, Everett died just a year or so later at age 70 in January 1865. And the public outpouring of grief led to a decision to place a statue of him in the public garden. It was dedicated in 1867 at this spot to the north of the lagoon, and that's Beacon Street, you can see in the background. The subscription for this statue raised funds far in excess of the original goal, and the surplus funds were used to help to pay for the Washington equestrian statue that was then in the works, as well as for a statue of the wartime governor, John Andrew, that is now located inside the State House. The sculptor of Everett's statue was William Wetmore Story. He was the son of the U.S. Supreme Court Associate Justice Joseph Story. The statue depicts Everett in a dramatic oratorical pose with his right arm raised, declaiming, exhorting, perhaps pontificating. Now, Story actually became especially well known for his statues of women in dramatic poses. And I must say, I find it a somewhat curious statue. It's not the greatest likeness of Everett. And since I already gave away the ending, you know that it no longer stands in the garden. So this is the first of the 5 statues that once were or might have been located there. And we'll return later on to learn what became of Everett's statue. So let's move on to the second statue, and this was the most prominent, it still today is the most prominent portrait statue in the garden, and perhaps the city's most iconic image. It's the magnificent George Washington equestrian statue that faces Arlington Street and really represents Boston itself in so many travel brochures. The subject, President George Washington, certainly needs no introduction. The statue was modeled in 1864 by Thomas Ball, the Boston sculptor, and completed and dedicated in 1869. Ball's original clay model is on display at the Boston Athenaeum. Now, this equestrian statue is a major Boston landmark, but it's not central to our story. So I'm going to move on. I just show you, this is an image from I think Expedia uses this to introduce folks to visit Boston. And there you see the model in the Athenaeum, which is really wonderful to see if you get the chance. Now, after Everett and Washington, a few years later in 1874, another prominent Massachusetts statesman of the Civil War era, Charles Sumner, died. And there was a public outpouring of grief that led to a decision to remember him in statuary. Sumner, as I'm sure many of you know, was a fierce abolitionist, best known for his blistering 1856 speech on the Senate floor, attacking the authors of the infamous Kansas-Nebraska Act, the crime against Kansas. This speech resulted in Sumner's brutal caning on the floor of the Senate by a South Carolina congressman that very nearly killed him. And despite the fact that he would be absent from the Senate for 3 years while he recovered, Sumner went on to be reelected 3 times, and he served as a senator until his death. Now, Charles Sumner was born into the Episcopal Church, but he became Unitarian. And when in Boston, he worshiped at King's Chapel throughout most of his adult life. At the time of his death, he lay in state at the State House, but then his funeral was held at King's Chapel. Now, in 1875, shortly after he died, a competition was held to design a portrait statue that resulted in this rather stolid work by Thomas Ball, the sculptor of the Washington equestrian statue. It was unveiled in 1878 and located on the south side of the lagoon, and originally faced northward, inward, toward Edward Everett. It's a decent piece of work, but it turns out it wasn't the actual winner of the first choice of the blind jury. Instead, the winner was a talented local sculptor and poet, or rather a sculptress and poetess. Anne Whitney, a woman from Watertown, would also give Boston the Samuel Adams statue that you see outside Faneuil Hall, and that curious Leif Erikson statue on Commonwealth Avenue at the Charles Gate. Now, if you visit the Watertown Public Library, you can find Whitney's original plaster model as you enter the reading room. And unfortunately for Whitney, when the judges learned of their choice of artist, they were scandalized. As a recent account in the Harvard Crimson put it, they, quote, they deemed it obscene for a woman to model a man's legs, and they disqualified her entry from consideration. Now, I don't know about you, but I look at these two statues and I find Whitney's design to be truly magnificent and far superior. And as a Cambridge resident, I am very glad that in 1912, shortly before her death, Whitney would live to see it realized in this bronze that's now installed outside Harvard's Johnston Gate, right between Harvard and the First Parish Church, upstairs from the Red Line, where I get to admire it several times a week. Now, so things would stand in the garden with these four statues, the Everett, Washington, Sumner, and the Ether Monument, for about 20 years. And this is a photo taken, it appears, from the steeple of Arlington Street Church. Must have been in the 1880s. It shows the garden in its early development. The trees are not yet grown up. And you can barely make out. I don't know if I can enlarge it. Yes, you can see there up in on the Beacon Street side, Edward Everett flailing with his arm up there. So Sumner is out of the frame to the south. He would be just over on the right side. And then an interesting thing happens. In 1889 or 1890, there came about the somewhat spontaneous placement of a curious and short-lived monument to a Boston Civil War hero, Colonel Thomas Cass. Cass was an Irish-born immigrant who became successful in his father's leather business in the North End and also served on the Boston School Committee. He was incidentally a Roman Catholic, but I don't think that piety figured much into his biography. I'm going to stick with this slide for a few minutes. When the Civil War broke out, Cass was called upon by Governor Andrew to form the 9th Regiment Volunteer Infantry, largely comprising Irish American soldiers from Massachusetts. The fame of this unit, known as the Fighting Ninth, helped to cement the reputation of Irish immigrants for patriotism and devotion to their new country, despite the immense prejudice that they faced, and nowhere worse than in Boston. Cass was extremely popular with his men. His regiment fought fiercely in several battles in the Virginia Peninsular Campaign, but at the Battle of Malvern Hill in July 1862, Cass was shot in the face and badly wounded. He was brought home to Boston, where he died a week later. His men remained devoted to his memory, and a quarter century later, in 1889, this rather crude granite statue of Cass was crafted and originally intended to be placed at his gravesite in Mount Auburn Cemetery. But when this grave marker arrived by train in Boston, a group of his former veteran soldiers, his veterans, decided sort of off the cuff that rather than taking it to the cemetery in Cambridge, they'd put it in the public garden instead. Now, this led to a bit of an outcry about the aesthetics of the monument and the brazenness of its placement, but there was no immediate pushback. And so it stayed there for a few years. But it was badly out of scale with the other monuments, and it quickly deteriorated due to the effects of weather. Something had to be done about Colonel Cass in the garden. And this apparently was the trigger for the formation of the Boston Art Commission, a body that exists to this day. Now, I'll get to the commission in a minute, but first I want to step back and take a look at Boston in 1890. And we're now in the era of a great power struggle in Boston politics. The old Yankee Brahmins of Boston, many of whom had joined the Unitarian movement in the early to mid 19th century, were declining in both relative and absolute numbers and influence. Many were starting to leave the city for the suburbs, and in an era of resurgent Anglophilia, Many Unitarians were also defecting to the Episcopal Church. Meanwhile, the immigrant Irish Catholic community was rising economically and reached more than a quarter of the population of the city and had amassed real political power that it would hold pretty much for the entire 20th century. Boston's very first Irish-born mayor, Hugh O'Brien, on the left, was elected in 1884, and by the turn of the century, most mayors would be of Irish heritage. In fact, during the 1890s, in total, more than 40% of the residents of Boston were foreign-born, even more than today's figure, which is about 27 to 28%. And by far, the largest group by ethnicity were Irish Americans. So the monument to Cass was the very first public representation of anyone of Irish heritage in Boston. In fact, I think he was probably the first Roman Catholic to be depicted on public property in Boston, apart from a small sort of garden statue of Christopher Columbus that was placed in Louisburg Square in the around 1850 or so. Now, Boston also, in addition to the shift in demographics, the city itself was booming and undergoing a radical physical transformation, both above ground in structures and below ground in infrastructure. So the downtown was rising. This is on the right, you see the 1893 Ames building, Boston's first skyscraper that would rise to about 14 stories. The city's population tripled between 1860 and 1890, partly through the annexation of surrounding towns, largely through immigration, first of the Irish, then Italians, Russian Jews, Eastern Europeans, and later on, internal African-American migration from the American South. And to serve this blossoming metropolis and to relieve congestion in the center of the city, America's very first subway opened in Boston in 1897. Initially, to complete the subway, which is part of today's Green Line, the city turned over the southernmost sliver of the public garden for a portal to take streetcar trolleys underground and serve two stops at Boylston Street and Park Street. So you can see just above Boylston Street the path that the subway initially took. And it also, I think you can see on this map, let me blow it up. Yeah, you can see the location of the four statues, Everett, Ether, Washington, and Sumner. The Cass Monument is not marked in this map, so I'm not sure if it was extant at this exact time that map was prepared. In any event, let me show you another image from that time of the subway portal, right around probably 1900. As you can see, Charles Sumner is still facing to the north toward the lagoon, and the trolley cars are entering and exiting the subway behind him. And now I want to turn back and talk about the Boston Art Commission, spurred, as I mentioned, in large part by the sudden appearance of the Cass statue and the helter-skelter growth of the city and the threat of sort of ad hocery in the placement of monuments. The state legislature decided in 1890 to form the city's very first municipal art commission for its capital city, and it would become a model for others all over the United States. The purpose of the commission was to bring some rigor, artistic judgment, and no doubt some political sensibility to the choice, the siting, and protection of statuary and other forms of public art. Initially, the commission included the mayor and representatives of the Museum of Fine Arts, MIT, the Boston Public Library, and the Boston Society of Architects. Since that time, the BAC has evolved, and it now includes citizen representation as well. And the Cass statue would be one of the very first items to receive the commission's focused attention. The old granite marker was removed and replaced with this excellent, very energetic and dignified bronze statue by Richard Brooks, which was unveiled in 1899. I have to believe the granite monument disappeared without a trace. But if you go to Mount Auburn today, there is a magnificent grave marker to Cass, memorializing him and his Ninth Regiment Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. Now, around this time, at the turn of the 20th century, the city also embarked on a new landscaping plan for the public garden put forth by the Olmsted brothers, the sons of Frederick Law Olmsted. This included a plan to develop a statuary mall along Boylston Street above the subway tunnel. The underground subway was extended along Boylston Street out to Kenmore Square, a project that was completed in about 1914. And this would allow the recovery of the garden's Boylston Street border and the creation of the mall that we see today. Here in this photo from the early 1900s, the Sumner statue has already been turned around to face south, as did the Cass statue. And space would now be made available for 2 or 3 more portrait statues in alignment with these monuments. You can also see the back of the canopy for the William Ellery Channing statue facing Arlington Street Church. And let's turn to address that. And I'm going to somewhat briefly talk about 3 monuments that were added in the next decade between 1903 and 1915. They're all fine statues, but they're not too terribly central to our story. So I'm going to be brief in mentioning these. The first one, by Herbert Adams, is of William Ellery Channing, a beloved figure familiar to us as UUs of a historical bent. He actually considered himself a congregational minister, but is regarded as the spiritual founder of American Unitarianism. The statue and its marble canopy faced the Arlington Street Church, which was the new home in the Back Bay of his church, which had been on Long Lane at the site on Federal Street that's now occupied by the Bank of America Tower. A second statue inside the Charles Street entrance to the garden honors yet another Unitarian minister, Edward Everett Hale, the nephew, in fact, of Edward Everett. Hale is perhaps best remembered today as a writer, a magazine publisher, and the author of the short story, The Man Without a Country, that was the most famous short story in America for 100 years. And by the way, it's also interesting to note that Hale was the principal speaker, or one of the principal speakers, at the dedication of our own new church building in Belmont in 1890. And I'm sure all of us have been in the conference room and seen that framed inscription of the Lend a Hand Society: look up and not down, look forward and not back, look out and not in, and lend a hand. Those are the words of Edward Everett Hale, who founded was the inspiration for that society. Hale also served as chaplain to the U.S. Senate late in life, and on one occasion, he was asked by one woman if he prayed for the Senate. And his response was, "No, madam, I look at the Senate and I pray for the country." I think he would really be a man for our times. So it's a charming statue, quite informal, on a low pedestal, and it depicts him as a gentle old man out for a walk in the garden. It's the work of Bela Pratt, a Connecticut-born sculptor who studied under St. Gaudens and in Europe. The third statue in the middle that I'll mention briefly was dedicated in 1915. Wendell Phillips was an attorney from a prominent Boston family who represented the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison at great personal cost and peril, as he was seen in his day by his fellow Unitarians as a traitor to his class. He was born and raised in the strict Calvinist tradition, but in time he moved away from any affiliation with a specific denomination, although his funeral was held at the Hollis Street Unitarian Church. And the Phillips really is an outstanding monument. The sculptor was the great Daniel Chester French, who did the Lincoln Memorial statue. But by now, it must surely, let's see, I'm going to hold off on that. It must surely have struck some as anomalous that in a city that was increasingly diverse, so many of the figures being depicted in the garden were white Protestant men, specifically Unitarians, in an increasingly Catholic city at a moment when Unitarianism was fading in influence. And in fact, around 1910, an effort began to remove the Edward Everett statue from the garden. It was first mentioned in the Art Commission's 1902 annual report and repeated in ensuing years. There were two ostensible reasons put forth for the move. First, to honor Edward Everett in the recently renamed Edward Everett Square in Dorchester. Second, there was an idea to make space for a children's playground in the public garden. The playground never materialized, and I don't know if the proposal was ever really serious. And I have to wonder if Everett himself, uh, uh, he was a man of, let me say, high self regard and frequently wounded pride. I'm not sure that he really would have chosen to be banished from the garden out to Dorchester. So, had Everett fallen out of fashion? And was it truly the case that the Dorchester residents were clamoring for his statue? Was the playground a serious proposal or a pretext? Or perhaps did the mayor want to clear things out and create room for a bit more representational balance? Now, there is another possibility not stated anywhere in the public record, and that is that Story's 1865 statue of Everett was just not as good a work of art as were the later statues that follow. Boston really could do better. I find support for this explanation in a book published in 1970 on Boston statues by Walter Whitehill, the Boston historian and longtime director of the Athenaeum. Whitehill wrote in that book that, quote, however eminent the subject, Story's statue with its upraised arm was somewhat ridiculous. And I think it might be just that simple. In any case, in accordance with a long matured plan, as we see here in the Art Commission's 1910 annual report, in 1911, Everett was finally removed from his prime spot near Beacon Street and sent off to a second, somewhat tortured afterlife in Dorchester. Now I'd like to turn to a fourth star-crossed statue that never made the grade, and yet one more Unitarian minister from the mid-19th century, in fact. Theodore Parker was the grandson of Captain John Parker, the Lexington farmer who told his men, it was at the Battle of Lexington Green, the shot heard round the world, if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. Theodore Parker, I believe, was the real deal. Unlike the tepid, compromising, and conservative Unitarians of Boston's merchant and professional class, he had the courage of his convictions. He was brilliant, fearless, endlessly hardworking, a fiery abolitionist, a transcendentalist ranking alongside Emerson, a strong women's rights advocate, and he's been described as the most famous 19th century preacher in America. I find it ironic that today, Parker's words remain world famous. Consider two such phrases: government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The arc of the moral universe is long, yet it bends toward justice. These aphorisms originated with Parker, yet he personally is almost completely unknown to today's Americans outside the UU tradition. Frankly, he deserves to be far better known among modern UUs within our tradition, because I believe in so many ways he represents the best of what we aspire to be today. Bill Blumberg is going to be talking, as I mentioned, about 19th century Unitarian ministers, and I hope we'll hear more about Parker in Bill's talk. Now, Parker's brilliant fire burned out at the young age of 49. He died in 1860 while visiting Italy, and he's buried in Florence. In the 1880s, some of his devoted followers raised a subscription to craft an impressive statue of him. It was sculpted by Robert Krause, the artist who also sculpted the Crispus Attucks Boston Massacre Monument on the Common. The statue was completed, cast in bronze, mounted on a pedestal. It was all ready to go. It was repeatedly offered to the city for placement in the garden or perhaps the Boston Common. And repeatedly it was rejected by the Art Commission. Why is this the case? It seems that Parker had a fatal weakness. As a religious liberal or radical public preacher in the 1840s and 1850s, Parker had voiced a fear of the rising influence of the Roman Catholic Church in America. And in several private letters, he expressed a barely concealed disdain for the flood of desperately poor Irish immigrants that he felt were degrading his city with poverty, crime, and disease. So it shouldn't surprise us that the dislike was apparently mutual. By the turn of the 20th century, Irish and Catholic political influence were becoming dominant in Boston, while the Unitarian movement was in retreat. None of this is made explicit in the Art Commission's reports. In part, this is my conjecture, but I also read that in rejecting the Parker statue, the Art Commission report claims that it was a poor likeness. This is baseless criticism. Those who knew him considered it quite a good work of art. In any event, poor Theodore Parker in bronze was shuttled off to a city storage facility where the statue sat until 1902, when it was rescued by his old church, the First Unitarian Parish in West Roxbury. The church placed it outside its handsome new meeting house on Center Street, which would be renamed the Theodore Parker Church in 1962. And there you can find it today on the church's small front lawn. Let me emphasize private land, not public city property like the other monuments that we've been discussing. And I encourage you to do that if you're in the West Roxbury neighborhood. I think you'll find it's a magnificent statue, perhaps a bit out of proportion to the modestly sized church building behind it. And now let's come to the fifth of my so-called wanderers, a statue of the Scottish poet Robert Burns. It was proposed by the Robert Burns Memorial Association and modeled in 1912 by Henry Hudson Kitson and tentatively accepted for a site on the Gardens Statuary Mall near Charles Street, probably around the site where the Phillips statue was installed. But the exact site was changed 3 times. The artist and the Burns Memorial Association dithered, and the actual statue itself was not cast. After a few years of what the commission termed annoying delays and unanswered questions to the Burns Memorial Association and the sculptor, the commission members became exasperated. The site was occupied probably by Wendell Phillips, and the Art Commission voted to give the Burns statue an inconspicuous place in the fens near the Muddy River. The statue was finally cast in 1919 and dedicated by Governor Calvin Coolidge on New Year's Day, 1920. And then, about 50 years later, something very bizarre happened. Ratty Burns was snatched up by a property developer named Ted Raymond and plunked down in Winthrop Square in front of the old Boston Record American building without any formal city approval process. Raymond was the man who led the redevelopment of the Winthrop Square property in the early 70s. Apparently, he'd been hoping that the city would let him take the statue of Boston's early founder, John Winthrop, which had formerly stood in the old Scollay Square, right in the heart of the intersection of Scollay Square before the era of urban renewal. But Raymond's request was refused. The Winthrop statue, incidentally, ended up at the First Church of Boston on Marlborough Street. And somehow, Raymond managed to pluck up the Burns statue in the Fenway, literally in the middle of the night, and moved it to the heart of downtown with no process, so that many people initially thought the statue had been stolen. So, folks, this was Boston in the 1970s. In any event, There it would stay for more than 40 years until the giant new Winthrop Square Tower was built just a few years ago. And at that time, it had to be cleared out for construction vehicles to get in and out. And the statue was restored to its original site in the Fenway in 2020 to mark its centennial of its initial installation. Now, let me just talk about two more final statues that actually did make it into the garden that are also of interest from the standpoint of diversity of representation. Here's the George Robert White Memorial in the garden's northwest corner near Beacon and Arlington Streets. White was a successful but modest, fairly anonymous businessman. He was a childless bachelor who made a large fortune in pharmaceuticals. And at the time of his death in 1922, he left the city of Boston a huge gift, $5 million, the equivalent of perhaps hundreds of millions today, for beautification projects throughout the city. Now, the gift stipulated that 50,000 should be reserved for a memorial fountain in his name. This beautiful memorial, sculpted by Daniel Chester French, was approved in 1923 and dedicated in 24. Now, it doesn't depict White himself. Rather, it is an idealized female figure known as the Angel of the Waters. And the angel is shown casting bread upon the waters to symbolize White's generosity in accordance with the proverb from Ecclesiastes. And it's ironic that the one and only statue of a woman in the public garden is actually an avatar for a man. And now the only statue in the garden, a figurative portrait statue that we haven't mentioned, is of Tadeusz Kosciuszko, the Polish patriot from the Revolutionary War era. Kosciuszko was a military engineer and architect who came to America in 1776 to join the Revolutionary War effort. He designed the fortifications at West Point. He served with distinction in several theaters and without pay for 7 years. He sustained a wartime injury. He ultimately rose to the rank of brigadier general, and then he returned to Poland in 1784. Now, what, you might ask, was Kosciuszko's connection to Boston? In fact, why are there so many statues of both Kosciuszko and his countryman Kazimierz Pulaski in the United States? According to the monuments audit, there are 10 monuments to Pulaski and 6 to Kosciuszko. And what I learned in researching this talk is that, in fact, there is no specific connection to Boston, nor is there to virtually any of the locations where these men are depicted. But there is an important connection to the time period when these statues were erected in the teens and 20s. The late 19th and early 20th centuries was the period of peak Polish immigration to America. Poland, in fact, didn't even exist as a nation state during this period. Its territory was split between Prussia and Russia until after World War I. Facing terrible conditions in their home country, Poles emigrating to America found severe prejudice in American cities, including Boston, as had the Irish immigrants before them. And so in the early 20th century, the Polish American community decided to launch a concerted campaign to emphasize their own loyalty and American patriotism. And one of the chosen approaches was to fund and erect these statues depicting these two Polish patriots who had been heroes and champions of democracy in the Revolutionary era. Ironically, the Boston statue was approved in 1925, just a year after the Johnson-Reed Act sharply restricted immigration. And already by the time this statue was installed in 1927, Polish immigration had seen a decline of 90%. But what's also of note regarding this statue is that for the very first time, the artist behind it was a woman named Alice Theo Ruggles Kitson. She also happened to be the wife of the sculptor of the Burns statue. And so with these two statues, we finally have the first physical representation of a woman in the public garden, although not a historical figure, as well as the first actual artistic work of a woman. And these would be the final portrait statues of any kind in the garden, whether by or of a female figure, unless, of course, one counts Mrs. Mallard and her ducklings, or the ungendered infants in the fountains near Arlington Street, both of which were the sculptural groups were the works of women artists. And so much, after so much change in a period of about 30 years, the garden has seen no further major change in statuary in the past 100 years, a remarkable period of stability. And yet, as I mentioned, Boston has continued to move on. And on another occasion, I do hope to talk with you about how Boston and other Massachusetts communities have been addressing the issue of representation in the past couple of decades through the installation of a number of impressive statues of women, African Americans, and others from other different backgrounds that were historically underrepresented. But before I end, I do want to round out the story of poor old Edward Everett after his banishment from the garden. You'll recall that the statue was removed in 1911, and it was placed at the heart of an intersection in Dorchester long known as Five Corners. It had been renamed Edward Everett Square in 1894. And with the rise of the automobile, it quickly became busy and congested. And unfortunately, the statue became a serious traffic hazard at its new location. It was struck repeatedly and knocked over, not once, but twice. And the granite pedestal, if you ever visit it, you'll see it still bears scars of those encounters with cars. In 1931, the statue was taken down and placed in storage for about 4 years. And then in 1935, it was brought out and relocated in this little patch, Richardson Park, which is nominally managed by the state's DCR. And the park is so poorly tended that the neighbors in Dorchester wish the city would take over responsibility for it. At the least, they have put up a fence around it to protect the statue from having someone put a party hat on it, as you see in the right-hand photograph. But for now, and perhaps for all time, there stands Edward Everett in this modest postage stamp park near his birthplace, surrounded by triple deckers. And meanwhile, back in the heart of Edward Everett Square, Everett has been replaced by a giant sculpture of a pear, the signature fruit of Dorchester in the 19th century. And the new nickname for this area, among some people, is Pear Square. And so it goes for Edward Everett, the Rodney Dangerfield of Massachusetts statesmen, the man with perhaps the greatest resume in American history who did not serve as president. But I doubt that one school child in 100 could recite more than one or two significant facts about him. Whenever he's mentioned, it's typically as the drone of Gettysburg, who spoke for 2 hours, contrasted with Lincoln, who gave the pithy address that history remembers so well. I'm not going to suggest that he should get his own legal holiday, but maybe the city could spruce up Richardson Park a bit. And perhaps on his birthday, April 11th, Boston's public school teachers could take 5 or 10 minutes to tell a bit of his story. And maybe the children that go home on that MBTA bus could be encouraged to take a moment to hop off at Columbia Road and check out this statue. So there you have it, a bit of color on a dozen odd statues, a lot of them depicting Unitarians in numbers, frankly, all out of proportion to their actual presence in the city. Some of them made the grade and can be found in this beautiful garden that all Bostonians treasure. Others, like Everett and Parker, have to be sought out in other parts of the city. But I hope that the talk has addressed in a helpful way this issue of representation and diversity and how that issue played out in maybe a bit of a muted way 100 years ago. So it's not an entirely new issue in this new time when we've gone through such a convulsion in recent years. By now, I've gone on almost as long as Edward Everett had used to talk. So I'm going to shut up and just say thank you and see if there are any questions.
Well, John, thank you so, so much. That was absolutely delightful. And you were able to show us your love of history mixed with art, mixed with the Boston Public Garden. And I found it fascinating. So thank you so, so much.
This is not really a question, but one of my favorite places to go in New England is to Augustus St. Gaudens's home in New Hampshire, just south. I think it's just south of where Dartmouth is, close to the river. It's just lovely. His
Yeah.
studio and his actual house and everything. So I recommend that to anybody who wants to stop in New Hampshire going north.
Great.
It's off Route 93.
Yes.
Uh,
Any
I
other
have an
questions?
observation. You showed us an equestrian statue, and I've learned that the amount of hooves that are in the air symbolize various things. So one hoof in the air means injured in a battle. If all are on the ground, uh, generally it's that they survived the war, the battle, and they died of natural causes. I think two in the air means that they died in battle.
You know, think of Andrew Jackson in Lafayette Square in Washington or in New Orleans. I've I've heard the same thing, Richard, and I don't know what two hoofs off the ground means. I know that there is supposed to be a convention, um, and I would have to refresh because, of course, Jackson survived the War of 1812 and went on to become president. I've
It's
never
it's
I've
it's
never
a
seen a statue
convention.
with, yeah,
It's a convention that's not always
yeah,
adhered to, so
yes,
it can be confusing. But it is interesting that you can look at the feet of the horses and guess certain things about its occupant.
yeah.
And John, I particularly loved the 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 old photographs you have of the city of Boston Public Garden, trying to think back and then bringing it forward to Pear Square.
Yeah,
Just enjoy
yeah,
it. So thank you. Thank you for your research.
yeah. Do many folks have early memories? I mean, the garden in the 50s, and um, was anybody around here in Boston? Do you remember those swan boat rides? And I mean, it does feel timeless to me, and I wonder if others have the same
For the 60s, at least.
of the 60s. Yeah.
John, I wanted to bring up someone who is a contemporary is of a lot of these sculptors is Edmonia Lewis. And she was first African American or person of color, also of Native American heritage, who was in Boston. Actually, she was sponsored by Hiram Powers. She was in
Hmm.
Boston for a short time, and she actually did a bust of Gould, a Shaw, that
Yeah.
was sold and was popular and enabled her to move to Paris because there was a lot of people, artists, particularly people of color, who moved to Paris. And Hiram Powers actually was the person who gave her studio space in Rome, I believe.
Uh-huh.
And she's in Mount Auburn. I could go on, but I
Yes.
right now there is Peabody Essex Museum is having a retrospective of her work.
Hmm.
So if you're interested in sculpture and you can never go wrong going to the Peabody anyway or Salem,
Yeah.
I recommend that you go up and see her work.
Sure will. I have seen the sculpture, the funerary monument in Mount Auburn is a lovely, yeah, lovely work. Lanier, you got your hand up.
Yeah, about the timelessness of the swan boats. I think I remember reading recently that the same family that started operating the swan boats still operates the swan boats. I can't remember where I think I read that in the Globe, but can't
Yeah.
verify it beyond just having a memory of reading it somewhere.
Yeah. It is interesting to me that so much has changed in other parts of the city, and yet the garden does have this, as I said, cast in amber, this timeless feel to it. And I by no means am I suggesting that there be any change in the garden. I guess, having conservative instincts, I love the idea of having broader representation in public art in the city. And the next talk that I'd love to give a look at how other parts of the city have been used as a canvas to depict people from other backgrounds. You can go up to the State House grounds or elsewhere in the South End. Um, so I'm not suggesting. I'm glad that there has not been a movement to alter the configuration of statues in the garden or on the Commonwealth Avenue Mall for that matter. But I certainly welcome, and I think this is in the next talk. I'd like to draw the contrast with two cities in particular, Richmond and New Orleans, where the issue of what to do about these huge Confederate monuments has been really, so divisive and vexing. But Boston, I think, has found a way to adapt over the past few decades that I think has been notably successful.
I'm so glad these are recorded so that we can, let other people know what they missed and that they still haven't missed it completely.
Next Alliance program will be on April the 9th, and it will be our state senator, Will Brownsberger, who will be speaking about what has prompted him to his passion of going into public service. So that will be really wonderful to look forward to. So thank you, John, for
Yeah,
all
thank
of
you,
your hard
John.
work and your passion, and we're lucky to have you as our
Wonderful.
historian.
Thanks.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Wonderful, John.
Thank you.